Welcome, everyone. This is the Contemporary Issues Forum. Coffee, Conversation, and Controversy was our former name. I'm Loretta Garcia. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Dale Miller-Hill. Let me just announce the next speaker will be April 16th. That is Watella Ibn Yusuf, and he will be speaking about reparations. He's actually going to lead a discussion. He's not going to make too much of a presentation. He is the co-chair of the DC chapter of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, in COBRA. And for 45 years, he's been studying Black and African American culture in the U.S. and history and culture. And he will talk about reparations and where those stand now. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte Jones Carroll, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Loretta. Yes, I'm excited to have Professor Castañeda here, Ernesto Castañeda. He's the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, as well as the Immigration Lab at American University. You're a sociologist by profession and academic training. We've had very good luck with the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American U. We've had speakers from them before, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, before the pandemic when everything shut down, but I'm very pleased. I think you were appointed last year, weren't you? And to be director of this, but
correct.
I just mention a couple of your books because I find the titles quite interesting. One is A Place to Call Home, Immigrant Belonging and Exclusion in New York, Paris, and Barcelona in 2018, and Building Walls, the Exclusion of Latin People in the US in 2019. And then another joint authorship of a book on social movements. So I think rather than continuing to introduce you, I would love to hear what you have to say, and we'll come back in a little while with hopefully with some questions and more audience. So Professor Castañeda.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Dear Charlotte, dear Loretta, thank you so much for your invitation and for allowing me to be here today. It's a pleasure joining you via Zoom and talking about these issues. As Carroll was saying, I direct the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, so I'll be happy to talk about U.S. Latin American relations at large. But particularly, I want to talk today about how immigrants are the ones bridging and crossing these borders in order to bring people together, right? So there's a lot of mobility. People from the Americas have been coming to what is now the U.S. for over 100 years, and same way, right? There's been a long influence of the U.S. and Canada in Mexico and Latin America for a long time, and more we see also migration from people from the north moving into Mexico City. There's always around 1 million U.S. citizens living in Mexico, but lately with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of digital nomads and others moving into, for example, Mexico City and working there. So I'm looking forward. I'm going to be spending July in Mexico, and I will be talking to some of the people moving there because, funny enough, they are also facing some of the same xenophobia, I guess you would say, that Latin Americans face in the U.S. about people getting upset that they don't speak the language in the streets, that they're going to make things worse, that the city cannot handle it, that they're going to make things more expensive. I think the only thing that hasn't been said is that crime will increase, but there's a fear a little bit. So, and that's important because one of the goals of my work is so that the reader or my students or the people I talk to try to put themselves in the shoes of an immigrant, a refugee, an asylum seeker, and think about what we would do in that situation. And many of those have been there, maybe our parents, our grandparents, but sometimes it's easy to forget that and to just see it from a place of, I don't want things to change, and these newcomers are going to threaten my way of life or situation as I know it. And again, that's not unique to the US today. There's a long history of that happening in different ways, and that also happens in other countries. So some of my work has also taken place in Europe, and there's similar dynamics, which locally, and that's why I love doing these talks, locally, most of those controversies or tensions or fears and a lot of the political discourse from many parties and a lot of the kind of the way the journalists frame it in a very sensationalistic, underlying the negatives or the pitfalls or the dangers of migration, having done research, talking to immigrants, looking at data, looking at trends, reading hundreds of works that colleagues are writing on migration issues from how it happens in the real world. There's a lot of opportunities brought up for migration, particularly for the country that receives them. Most of the people improve their lives or are safer once they have moved abroad when they're escaping persecution or violence or religious intolerance or other types of exclusion. So migration is a positive story, it's a happy story, and it could be even better. It could be even a happier story if we change a few policies and a few attitudes through talks like this, through education, that won't put any country at a disadvantage or at a harm. So again, I think it's important for me to underline that, and a lot of audiences are always skeptical about that. So I'm gonna leave the bulk of the time here to answer Q&A, or then I can go through some specific points and provide a bit more information. But that's the thing. It's a thing that morally, religiously, ethically, it's always good to welcome the person in need, right? A stranger that we don't know, and still kind of provide them refuge. It's a good thing to do, ethically, morally speaking. But also in a very pragmatic economic policy sense, welcoming the stranger is something that has enriched communities and cities for hundreds of years. So immigration, contrary to what we hear often, is one of these spaces where doing the right thing in the moral sense and doing the right thing in the policy, economic, kind of self-interest thing matches really well. So it should be a no-brainer to have more welcoming policies towards asylum seekers, refugees, and more policies that allow for orderly, which just means making it safer for people coming to stay here. Now, some people will be like, well, but we cannot open the borders. We cannot let anybody that wants to come in here because there is no space, because we don't have the resources for that. Because everybody, if we open the door, some people say from all walks of life, they say that everybody in the world will want to move in here. So that's the first misconception that I would like to address, is that, as you can imagine, it would take a lot for me to tell you, hey, ladies and gentlemen, Sweden has free education, free healthcare, beautiful scenery, great museums that are very affordable, people are friendly. You should all go to Sweden tomorrow. Probably many of you won't take me on that offer, right? Even though America is not perfect and there's a lot of gun violence and there's almost no gun violence in Europe, that doesn't mean that you're just going to pack up your bags and move tomorrow. There's probably family, friends, jobs, tradition, language that holds you to the DMV in this particular case. So is the case for most people around the world. People want to stay in the place where they were born and raised, partly because there's the people that they love living around them, and a very strong need to keep them. There's always exceptions, right? There's the adventurer a few times, the traveler who wants to experience difference, and they will go far away, and that's happened throughout. And again, that's not a bad thing, right? That continues to happen. And again, Americans and people from Europe have been doing that for a long time. But for families to move, or for a mother or a father to move long distance to another city or another country, the economic need has to be very high. The political persecution has to be real. Not joining the freedom of religion, freedom of expression that they may desire, that may push them to leave. So most people that are on the move are people that are escaping war, as we see very clearly with Ukrainians now with the Russian invasion. They were not planning to leave, most of them, and now they have to. Or climate change, climate disasters related to that. There are people pushing people in Central America. Some of the reasons people have been living in the last 10 years is that there's an increasing drought, a lack of water for basic agriculture that some families used to depend on, that has worsened in some parts of Central America in the last few years. So that's why people leave. War, civil war, extortion by organized crime, by gangs taking over territory and saying that if you don't join the gang, I'm going to kill you. Then the youth may leave. When they leave, well, they go to places where they already have family members. So that's the second point I would like to touch on today. The first being that most people don't want to migrate. And just to finish that point, most of the data that we have for the last few years, and few years, I'm talking like the last 20 years, is that it's only around between 3 and 4% of the world population lives in a country different from where they were born. Again, 95% and plus of the people stick in their countries where they were born. And you will say, well, yeah, but now people move around. And many of you, I am assuming, many of you probably have a college degree, postgraduate degree, highly educated. So you may have lived in different states of the union throughout your life. Many of people in America, again, not everybody, but a good 20, 30% go to a different state for college. And then once you have moved once, then you are more likely to move again. So two things about America. We have seen a decline in internal mobility, people moving within the US territories and the continental US has been going down a lot since the 70s. And we have seen this industrialization. We have seen some negative effects related to that. Where, for example, at the same time, when we have been doing a lot of trade and a lot of importing of goods from China, and China has industrialized a lot because of US foreign investment there, we have seen the number of people moving within China grow exponentially. So from the 2000s till now, we have more people moving within China for labor reasons, as many, around 300 million, as many as people leaving a country and living in another country abroad in the rest of the world. So a lot of the times, the history of migration is of people coming and going between Maryland to the DMV, between the DMV and Virginia, or moving from California to New York. You know people that have done that, you've done that. So it's the same thing, but some people happen to traverse a border. So I may go and work next at the University of British Columbia or at McGill in Montreal. That will be an international migration, but it'll be very similar to that. And that is not problematized. But when it's working class people, people of color, and they don't have a way to do that legally, sometimes we put people in prison, we deport them. So most people, more than 95% want to stay home and stay home. The second point that I was trying to make is that immigration is not an individual decision for the most part. It's something that is responding to, again, large things, industrialization in China, climate change, civil war in El Salvador in the 80s, that is going to push people. You're going to be forced to make the decision to migrate. But most people, as you know, we don't live alone. We cannot support ourselves by ourselves. We depend on parents when you're younger, on extended family, on spouses, and we have to take care of our children. So migration, people escaping the Holocaust and escaping war, they're going to try to migrate as a group, unless there's a decision, like right now we have in Ukraine, that the father or the males that are older than 18 are going to stay behind to join the war effort. And then there's a family separation happening. But again, most people working in the World Bank, in the IMF, in the embassies, when they come from other countries to work here in DC, their preference is to bring their family with them. And the US gives them visas to do that. And again, if people from the State Department want to move to another country for service abroad, they always have the option legally to bring their family members. But if we're talking about agricultural workers working in California, Florida, etc., they're only allowed to come here as workers, as single people. People working with the crab industry in Maryland, they're come as single people, although most of them have families. So we have a lot of women, indigenous women from Mexico, coming and working from some season with a work visa and then coming back. But then we saw with increasing closing of the border and criminalization of the border in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, etc., a lot of the people, for example, from Mexico, Central America, and other places, the father would come alone, or the mother from the Philippines will come alone, making the decision, quote unquote, to leave their children behind. Because again, it's a dangerous trick. So they don't want to put them in danger. And then another of the rationales is, okay, I'm going to work in the DMV, I'm going to earn dollars, and then I can send them to Guatemala, where they will go a long way. So then my child will be able to have more money for books, for food, in theory for education, they may go to college. So all these people make these calculations in their mind because the neighbor has made them, because there's incentive, because they have a family member already living in Washington who's telling them, I have a job for you here. My boss wants more people like me. They'll hire you even if you don't have papers, even if you don't speak English, we'll get a job for you. And if you walk around, for example, Rosslyn, or what they call now National Landing in Northern Virginia, there's signs all over the place in Spanish saying, we need electricians, we need bricklayers. And for example, one building being built in Northern Virginia, I was talking to the construction workers there, and just one building is hiring 300 Guatemalans for that one project. Some of them have been here for a long time, some of them are more recent arrivals. So then it's easy for them to come here because there's jobs waiting for them. But that means that the family, the nuclear family, many of the members stay behind for a while. But then it sounds good. Okay, I'm going to send you money and all that. But that means that you're not going to see. I spend a lot of hours away from my kids when I'm in the office. But then I see them at night. I see them on the weekends and all that. So there's always this separation of the household and the home is decreasing as we're talking with the pandemic and the ability to work from home. But imagine now this. It wasn't rare from women from the Philippines, from men from Central America and Latin America to have spent 10 or 12 years away from their little children. So much that the children don't see their biological parents as their parents, because in effect, it's been the grandparents who have been the de facto dad or mom of in the everyday life, right? Of raising them, taking them to school, listening to their problems, playing with them, exercising discipline, putting the rules of the household. So when, in the rare cases that the people are able to regularize the status in the US, and they apply for a family reunification visa, which is a process that for Chinese, Indian, Mexicans may take over a decade, if not 20 years or more. For some other countries, it's faster, but still, it can be at least 5-6 years. So once they get reunited, now you have the Salvadorian parents, now their unaccompanied children cross the border legally or undocumented, because let's say my grandmother is getting very sick. The gangs are putting pressure on me because I'm becoming a young adult. They want me to join the gang. My grandma, who's taking care of me my whole life, has just died. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna meet my parents in Maryland. So here they come, right? Then they arrive and they don't know the language. They will learn it. But they need money. They arrive with their parents. The parents start struggling, working 2 or 3 jobs. They don't have a lot of time to spend with them. They may not have enough time to support them fully. So that's why we see a lot of minors working, because there's a lot of economic need. It's not that they're bad people. It's not that they don't care about education. Not at all. But sometimes they may be forced by the circumstances to work, as we've seen in the news lately. And I'm happy to talk about that. But then we have a situation when finally the biological mother and or father are able to meet their biological kid that they have been supporting economically, caring about, loving at a distance, and now they finally live together. So it will be family, happy ever after, right? But we have talked to dozens of families in this situation, and sometimes, yes, things, they meet each other, they are happy, and they start a new life as a family. But as you could imagine, after being away from, again, over 10 years, they don't really know each other. So it's what Leslie Bock, my co-author and wife, clinical social worker, and me calling a paper, for example, that they become families of strangers, in the sense that they are biologically related, they are legally living together, in the sense that they are mother-child, they are legally and biologically related, but they don't know each other because they have lived apart for over a decade. So there is a lot of misunderstandings. It's very hard for the mother to put curfew or put regulations on cell phone use, TikTok use on the youth, because they say, well, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm used to listening to my grandmother and following her rules, but you are more like a pal. So I don't know about that. I mean, they may say that explicitly or not, but that's a little bit of the tension. And there's also a lot of feeling that the kids have, the youth may have, of being abandoned by their parents. The parents did a lot of love. They supported them economically. They sent money. They kept connections. They talked on the phone. They used new communications to stay up to date. But still, for a lot of the minors that we have interviewed, many of them experience it as abandonment, as a lack of love. They don't understand. And again, they got therapy for this, and some of them digest it. We have had cases when this happens for generations. So, for example, in the early 2000s, we're speaking to a Dominican mother whose mother had left her behind in the Dominican Republic when she was working in New York. She was very upset by that. It was hard for her to form strong relationships. She was very mistrusting of her husband because she thought he would do the same and disappear one day and leave her behind, like her mother did. And she was very hurt, and she was able to verbalize this in therapy. But then she had children, and then she did the same thing. And again, not out of the decision, she came and work in moving with her mother, biological mother, got a job and was able to contribute to the family working in the US, but couldn't bring legally and didn't want to risk it. So she left her daughter back in the DR and repeated a story that for her was very painful. She was put in the same situation. Again, these are not decisions. These are kind of the immigration legal system that for relatively low education, low skill folks, there's not a way for families to migrate as a unit. So there's a lot of pain that is caused. We have discussed a lot in America during the Trump administration, the forced family separation of family units traveling together that were put apart in the border. And that was a big scandal, and people rightly rejected that and denounced that. But in a book that I'm finishing, me and my co-author, Daniel Jenks, a former student, were arguing that part of the immigration law, or lack thereof, forces or creates these family separations that become kind of part of the system except for a few of the highly educated, skilled immigrants. And so that's another thing. Family migration is a family situation, but one where the family suffers a lot because not everybody is able to migrate at the same time or with the same legal facilities or benefits. And the third point, and then we'll open it to Q&A, is that once people arrive, once people are able to settle, people want to get a job, and with that job, they're able to pay rent. It's becoming harder and harder with B&B, but people have been doing it for a long time, maybe sharing households, living in small places. But immigrants always find a way because the parents are sacrificing for the children to do better. And that often is the case, particularly in the East Coast. So immigrants come, immigrants pay for their own housing. Immigrants, as we know, for a lot of research, they're less likely to use welfare benefits, even if the kids born in the US have the right for food stamps, for example. Parents are very worried, even before Trump, that if they use some of the social welfare programs, it may be hard for them or family members to get regularized and become citizens later. So they stay away from that, and that impacts their thing. What I'm trying to say is that it's not true, this stereotype that exists, that immigrants are just coming to a country for the welfare benefits. That is not true. And if they were doing that, they wouldn't be coming to the US, right? They will be going to countries where are more of a social democracy. So to a degree, the life of immigrants fits really well this neoliberal idea of pulling yourself by your bootstraps. Immigrants have always worked really hard to kind of make their families come through and move along. So So that's one thing. And then immigrants go to school, the children, when they're young, and dreamers, and they learn English. All immigrant groups, by the third generation, almost everybody speaks English, and they have lost the mother tongue. It's great when the generation in the middle, the young people, the second generation, or the parents are able to be bilingual. There's a lot of benefits to that. So sometimes if we hear people speaking Spanish in the streets in Silver Spring or wherever, it doesn't mean necessarily that they don't speak English. It's just that maybe the language they choose to speak with connationals or with the kids as part of their the continuation of the culture. But that doesn't mean that people don't Americanize. And American culture is very attractive in all senses. It's always been. So immigrants, whether they were from Germany, from Ireland, etc., they were always very quick to learn English if they had the time and resources to do so. So, so immigration, it's not, it's hard for an individual going through, but it's not going to create, and there's a lot of people that have written about certain groups or certain religions, whether because they were Catholic or Jewish back in the day, or now Muslims, that it's incompatible, that they will never be able to be part of American society. But as you know, America has always been a congregational or a multi-religious society. So that's been a strength of the U.S. that will continue. So I want to finish by saying that immigration is a positive story. Immigrants want to integrate, want to be part of things. They do so, and by doing so, they create more demand for housing. That creates wealth for the renters or the developers. Cities grow or decrease, and growing sometimes is painful, but city getting stagnated is really hard. They're going to become depopulated, and we see cities like Pittsburgh, like Baltimore, that suffer depopulation, and that hasn't been a good story. Part of the reason that some cities are doing so well, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, or the Washington region, is because of immigration, national or international. So that's a positive thing. And immigrants are coming to work. So by working, they contribute to Social Security. They make the business make more money. We're able to go to restaurants and have food that immigrants serve, prepare, cook, grow. And we've seen the DMV since the pandemic, how I was in a Thai restaurant yesterday, and the first thing I arrived, there's a sign saying, because of a scarcity of labor, you may have to wait longer for a table. So again, immigrants are actually a positive, and when migration goes down, we all suffer for it. And again, it's not that everybody would come here if the borders were open, but a few people want to come in, and if they come in, it's good for them for the most part. It's good for us. And if somebody does engage in crime, breaks the law, and all that, well, we have a legal system to deal with that. So let me stop here and open it to Q&A. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Castañeda. We really appreciate your informative remarks. If anyone has a question, please feel free to post it in the chat box, or if you just want to raise your electronic hand, we can call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, I saw a hand earlier.
Yes, please, Charlotte. Charlotte, go ahead and ask.
Thanks so much. I really have two questions, but let's start. As you were opening up, you kind of talked about how the narrative, well, you're preaching to the choir in a way, of course, because the narrative in some quarters is so negative about immigrants, and you were giving us a lot of reasons why it should not be. How can we change the narrative? We've tried, this congregation and I have spent years working on Immigration Film Fest with the idea that films are attractive, but again, the audiences that would come to that were pretty much those who already appreciated the roles of immigrants. And, it was a good way of showing the humanity of immigrants and what they faced and their struggles and that sort of thing. But do you have any thoughts about, even your talk right now is intending to try to help change the narrative. And if you have any other ideas about how in this polarized country we can keep changing that narrative, I would love to hear them.
Thank you, Charlotte. That's extremely important. To change the narrative is the way to frame it, and it's work that needs to be done. So thank you for doing that. And you're right, films, books are a great way for people to empathize. And it's good that you organize that film festival, and I think I probably have attended in the past. But part of the issue is that we have to change the narrative worldwide or nationwide, right? So I think part of the problem that we face in the US today is that it's incredible, right? But Latinos aren't represented in Hollywood movies, even though a lot of the stuff is made in LA, where it's like at least 50% Latino. And whenever you see images of Latinos in Los Angeles, they rarely appear, or they, with a few exceptions, or appear as servants or as gang members or as drug traffickers, right? So, or people have to look very, and I hope that is changing, but not long ago, people had to look very particularly for stories of Asian people, stories of refugees, or stories taking place abroad. It was a very the narrative was a very mainstream one, if you want to decide it. So it's going to lead it against the grain, but that's what this work is really important. Another thing is that I've tried, so I also direct the immigration lab, and one of the things we try to do is also change the narrative with data figures, education, and that helps for people who are in between, who are listening, who are not necessarily part of the choir already, but they are willing to sing along. But the problem is the other half, right? That's your question, and I think that's a very important thing. Even this morning, I was reading a New York Times piece about the horrible deaths by the fire in the Mexican detention station in Ciudad Juarez, and the journalists working for the New York Times, they use words like the mayor of Ciudad Juarez is facing a lot of issues by the growing flow of people and the increasing number. So in the article by a supposedly centrist media thing trying to be objective, there were like 4 or 5 instances where the language used to talk about the Central and South Americans in Mexico is one of treating them as a burden, of treating the immigrants as a problem. And when people are telling the story about, okay, this horrible thing, immigrants died, if there's a time to be sympathetic, would be that, talking about the deaths. Even then, the message is one of, well, they shouldn't be here in the first place. So that's pervasive in the media, and I'm not talking about Fox News. In all the media outlets, I think journalists have grown accustomed and normalized to make immigration an issue, right? People should stay in their boxes, they should stay in the country they were born, and if they're outside, that is curious, interesting for some of us, or it's problematic, right? It's abnormal, it's unnatural. So therefore, it's newsworthy, and the language that is used. So I try to talk as much as possible to journalists to try to change that narrative in the stories that we hear. And I think it'll be very important. It's very time consuming, but I think if what I've done lately, for example, I don't share any more stories from the New York Times that deal with migration that have this language that is very dehumanizing. I try to go to some other more local or smaller media that sometimes are better, don't have that judgmental feeling of it. And I think the New York Times is very sensitive when people from the center or the right attack them for being too liberal. But I think people more in the center left and further left, we have to also be very vocal in a way that their way they frame things has a political effect. And people that claim to be apolitical about these issues, they're actually taking sides. So that'll be kind of the first parts of the answer. And then to finish, another thing is that we have to reach out to the people that openly have a negative view of immigration, and not to have a debate or to have to polemize with them, but then invite them to see these movies, to read these books, to have these conversations. Because we know that when there's interaction between foreign-born folks and people born in a country, a lot of the stereotypes disappear after a while. In opinion polls, it's people in areas, rural areas, or people in parts of the country where actually diversity and immigration is low, that happen to have the most anti-immigrant views and are more likely to vote for particular parties and all that. But in cities that are more diverse and where people are more likely to interact with people born abroad in the streets, not everybody, but more people don't see immigration as an issue, because they say, okay, yeah, Well, my neighbor is born here, my other person that I know is born somewhere else, this other person I know is from another country, and it's just part, and you like them as individuals, or you know they're people, imperfect like everybody else, and it becomes an issue. So a lot of the times, the anti-immigrant views are coming from an ignorance, from an ignorance of a lived experience, and that is harder to breach. Loretta.
Thank you, Dr. Castañeda. Can you talk a little bit about education? You mentioned that when kids are, remain home and then they come here as teenagers. I know Montgomery County Public Schools has teenagers in high school that are 18 and 19 years old. They do make some grace for those kids who came in the later years. Can you talk about what's happening generally in the country in that regard?
Yeah. Education is a great way for to achieve social mobility, and it's not perfect, but it is working. People that graduate from college in the US do better. And there was a recent book that has very convincing data that a college degree is more equalizing than the people thought. People come to college with different socioeconomic backgrounds, but somehow that college degree from the same institution levels the field a little bit more than we thought. So if immigrants can get into that, it's going to be a big way for them to join the middle class and to decrease these tensions. But they cannot get there unless they finish high school. So that's where your question is very important. What we see, for example, with Central American young people coming to the DMV, we started this study in 2015. So it's been 8 years. And a lot of the kids we have interacting with are people that are coming, not all of them, but some of them are coming from poor, small towns in rural Central America. So they may not have a middle school. They may not have a high school built that is free and accessible in their town. They may have to travel long distance, which again, in some cases, because of gang control, that wasn't possible. So many of them are what educators call strife. So it's schools with interrupted schooling, basically. So that's what they may come and join a senior high school class, or not even a freshman high school class, but they have been out of school for 3 years, or they're at the level of algebra and other things, not only English, that is more of one of a 15-year-old, even though they are 18 or 19. So that's why you may have them with older kids, with younger kids, because that's where they are in terms of their education. So it's a good program, and it's good to have that option. But you can imagine how, as an older student, they may feel bad about it, right? That they may feel that they are seen as stupid because they are older and they are with younger kids. So it doesn't create ideal dynamics. And again, if they are 18, 19, and they can work and get a good salary, or go in school and be made fun of or feel inadequate because they will take some years for them to learn English, we see, unfortunately, a lot of kids drop out. Particularly, we have seen that poor kids, for example, from Guatemala, or kids that are indigenous, whose Spanish already is not their first language. They may speak Mayan, one of the Mayan languages. So they don't have an academic Spanish that you may need in a bilingual school in the DMV. And then learning English is also harder if the teacher is assuming that they speak Spanish and doing the translation from Spanish to English. The Mayan is kind of lost, so you're going to lose them. So it's not an easy thing. A lot of counties in the area are doing a great job, and when the teachers and the advisors know about these family dynamics that I was telling you about, and some people are experts now on this, they do a better job in helping them as students. But it is an important issue, and it's glad that we have to support our school boards to address the needs of this population. So again, if they graduate from high school, they'll have a better, more opportunities, and it'll be better for everybody than if a few of them do become active in some of the few gangs that exist in the area. It's not a major issue. It's not, most of them is not as bad as it used to be in Central America. But if you drop out of school and you don't have a way for a good paying job, and your parents are too busy, it doesn't create a good dynamic. So it's better to prevent all that by putting resources on these kids so they can finish school through these programs, or through a GED or something like that, or putting them into professional careers, technical careers. Thank you. Donald, you had your hand up.
Yes. I really appreciated your discussion of the effects on family with these long time separations. And that for the immigration policies, that should be given a lot more consideration. Then you were discussing how you were trying to change some perceptions by talking about the media, journalism. But also, there's been a great need for labor in this country, that the immigrants are actually fulfilling through some programs, agricultural programs, for instance. But where is the business community not supporting more immigration to fill the needs of such labor needs in this country? What's your view on that?
Yeah, the business community knows this. They will completely agree with you, and they say that when they lobby the Congress behind closed doors. They used to be very immigrant businesses, chambers of commerce. They were very pro-immigrant, even with Bush, obviously with Obama, but with Trump, the dynamic in terms of lobbying and in the Republican Party, the rhetoric against immigrants really worsened. So a lot of the business leaders and business groups have become quieter than ever in trying to lobby or speak publicly about these issues. A few exceptions are, for example, Facebook and the Silicon Valley firms that were pushing very vocally for more visas for the highly educated people that they need to keep Silicon Valley going. People think of people from India, China, Mexico, engineers, computer scientists, that we don't train enough in the US to satisfy the demand. So they're the ones that have been the most vocal, but otherwise, they also feel that it has become dangerous and risky for them to talk about these issues. And that's the problem. I think the proverbial we have allowed the very loud, toxic, negative voices in the minority, less than 30% of the population, that are xenophobic, anti-immigrant, even have some very racist assumptions and desires, take over this topic of immigration, and then make it so that we all think that immigration is a controversial issue, or that immigration is very political, or that it's a very polarized thing. Most public poll opinions, people voting Democrat, Independent, or Republican, more than the great majority, over 80%, are in favor of regularizing dreamers. Most of them are in favor of regularizing people that work here and live here. So they wouldn't be actually against an immigration reform. The American population at large is actually very pro-immigrant, and they understand these dynamics. But then in the Democratic Party, the leaders sometimes are afraid also of touching this and borrow some talking points from the right. And more than ever, the Republican Party has made it really hard for a real comprehensive immigration reform, or something that would help the business leaders with their goals. So even business leaders that maybe Republican may have supported candidates in the past, and now be one of the issues that they were asking for support. It's becoming harder for them to do so because of the Republican Party as in large going to the extreme on this issue. But it's not sustainable. There's always a need, and we saw with the pandemic that essential workers were very important regardless of their immigration status. And also, while this is happening, there's been some work visa programs that have been expanded. So there's important numbers of people, mainly from Mexico, that come legally to work in agriculture, private and other services every year in a temporary visa. And that's been almost invisible because it's legal, it's non-political, it happens and it doesn't call any attention. Funny enough, these are people coming to ask for the legal right of asylum, escaping persecution, arriving at the border. That is actually not in record numbers, but they're actually coming and turning themselves in. So they are counted and they are told no, and they go back and they come back and they are counted again. So the counting seems very large, but it's actually not, doesn't compare to other times that we have been in the US. And all of them, although they are escaping persecution of one type, they would come and work. So they will also solve that problem. But right now, I think there's there's a mismatch between what's good for the economy and how much faster and better we will have recovered from the pandemic, the economic effects of that, and immigration had stayed at more regular levels. But since the pandemic and the couple of years after, immigration went down, the population size went down. So we could have been in worse trouble. And now, for example, the number of refugees settled is been lower than for a long time. So I agree. I think there's more room for business leaders, small business owners. They know it, that they need more workers. But again, I think it's harder to get a bipartisan support for this now.
Are there any other questions? You can post them in the chat. Of course, immigration is both at the upper and lower ends of the labor market. Have you done any study on whether there will be an impact from virtual communications on that upper end of the spectrum?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of the debate is about people that we consider poor coming from other countries. But most of the people that move are people that are relatively well off. Even some of the people coming right now from Colombia, from traditionally people coming from Cuba were the elite, the best off. People coming from Venezuela early on were the people that had, in order to migrate to the US, to walk your way through or to pay a smuggler, you have to have at least $10,000 saved. That for a lot of countries, that's a lot of wealth. So you were not the poorest of the poor in those countries. You were kind of middle class, and you sold your house, your small business, to have those resources, so you and your family can come to try to come here. So it's actually being a successful refugee immigrant. It's a middle class program. The poorest of the poor, they are too poor to even leave their towns where they are at. Now, at the very top, mobility has been relatively easy for people with high skill, high education levels, people that have studied abroad already. And if anything, the pandemic, for example, affected a lot of the economies in South America. So Argentina is doing quite bad with inflation, really, really bad, much worse than us by many times. Chile was for a long time housing a lot of Haitians that were working and living there fine. With the pandemic, there was a lot of effects in the economy. So a lot of those Haitians left and came north. So also some Chileans that probably were doing fine before the pandemic, they may find themselves getting jobs here. A lot of the most highly educated Colombians, Venezuelans are already working in the US, and we'll see the effects of other people. And as much as telework is an issue, it's still not the case that big corporations based in the DMV are going to have some of the jobs outsourced, not outsourced, but they're going to have staff members that live in other parts of the world that are at the same level as the people physically in the US, even if they're not going to the office every day. There's still not that connection of expanding the telework options to people in other countries. Yeah, they can be contracted for a task, or they can be paid for a project or be consultants, but I don't think a lot of people have that, except for people that are American citizens that were living here and in a corporation or a government office, and I have decided that it's cheaper for them to live part of the year in a country with a lower cost of living. That's what we're seeing that. So we're seeing important numbers of people from the global north going to the global south and still being connected to the infrastructure here. So that's something that we relatively new that we're keeping an eye on, and we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And again, that could be that should be a right that people have, and there should be provisions for people doing that to be able to access healthcare abroad, etc.
Great, thank you. I see Hamid Aziz has his hand up. Can you unmute and ask your question, Hamid?
Good afternoon, Dr. Ernesto. So good to see you. So good to hear from you. I want to divert the attention a little bit from immigration to the home countries. In particular, what is it about El Salvador or Guatemala that the people risk their lives, travel 2,000 miles, sometime on the foot, cross the rivers to come here, while the people from Costa Rica do not? What's the matter with Costa Rica? Number one. Number two, you mentioned about English speaking is more preferred over here. Why the folks from Jamaica, where the English is the mother tongue, do not come over here? So we can talk about the immigration policies in the United States, and that's a very good thing. But at the same time, we have to talk about the desire, but more importantly, the need to immigrate. I am an immigrant myself, and I wanted to show you that it is a heartbreaking thing for one to migrate and leave one's family and one's friends and the things one loves about the sweet home back over there. So we have to talk about that. What is the matter with El Salvador and Guatemala that provide us these immigrants with heartbreaking stories, and why they cannot become like Costa Rica? End of my spiel, sir.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Yes, we started to talk about saying how most people want to stay home because of loved ones and because of familiarity with the place where they live. So you're absolutely right. So it's an exception that people have to be in very dire straits for them to come to want to go far away and live in another place. So yeah, that is true. Now it's also, so now you're asking what's going on in Salvador and in Guatemala. And again, it'll be important to remember that most people in El Salvador, at least 80% of the population, still lives in El Salvador. And it's not going to change. It's not like if the US suddenly says, hey, all Salvadorians come here, everybody from El Salvador is going to come here. That's not true. I've been more and more going to El Salvador lately, and a lot of people are doing quite well. When we're interviewing the immigrants from El Salvador that came here in the last few years, particularly youth, one of the main reasons was secondary effects of climate change, lack of water for people in rural areas. And the other one was very common, even more common, was family reunification. My mom came here in the 80s because civil war, many times supported by US foreign policies. They want to reunite with their family. That's a big reason. Then climate change. And then the other one was that the particular people, not in all El Salvador, not in all Guatemala, not in all Honduras, but in some regions, the state will have a lower presence, and some of the organized crime will have a lot of control. And they will be, join the gang or do this or pay rent, or we're going to kill you, or they already killed somebody. So that's why they have to escape to save their lives, because they have real death threats. A lot of people have told us that, and they may have PTSD from that. Some of them, not all of them. Interesting, so again, it's not something cultural or biological or geographical, obviously. So for example, right now in El Salvador, the new president, Bukele, is being really aggressive, a little bit too much, some people will say, but it's been effective in removing the gangs from the streets and having impunity, in the sense that they could go around businesses and the police and the army will stay away. He's done the opposite, to the point that now I think it's around 3% of the population in El Salvador that are in prison. And again, there may be some people there for political reasons, and it may human rights violations, so that is a real issue. But people now feel safer going out in the streets. They started small businesses selling food in the streets. People are back in the parks playing soccer. So if things continue like this, which it looks that it will and hopefully will, in terms of public safety in the streets of El Salvador, even in small towns, a lot of the people that were coming here, even recently, escaping gang violence, they won't. If they can stay safe and live there, they will. Same thing for Mexico. If the war on drugs, the dynamics change, and the military either retreat back, or the allure, the economic allure of the drug trade went down, and some parts of Mexico were safer, those people wouldn't want to come here to protect their lives, that's for sure. So these things change through time. So Costa Rica, for example, was the #1 destination of tourism from abroad recently, but it seems that this year, according to the Salvadoran president, now El Salvador is attracting more tourism than even Costa Rica. He just announced that if you're starting a new business having to do with computers, electronics, virtual Silicon Valley type of businesses, and you do that in El Salvador, you won't pay taxes in any of the profits or the development of new products and ideas and all that. So he's hoping to attract a lot of venture capitalists in this arena from around the world. And he probably will succeed to a degree, because some people, he's investing a lot on crypto. Some of these things are open-ended, they're risky. We don't know if that's going to work, but there's going to be more foreigners from the global north moving into El Salvador. So we may see, when we talk again in 8 years about the situation from El Salvador, it may not be that issue. So good governance, impunity, corruption, or more than corruption, like poverty, and then people using organized crime to export drugs, mainly to the US, and getting away with it, and taking a lot of the power and a lot of the functions of the state, that impacts civilians. So we see that. And again, the Ukrainians, Afghans, that's a very big example, right, about how war is one of the main displacers of people against their will. Most people are forcibly displaced. So thank you for the comment.
Thank you. So I see two questioners. Charlotte, let's go to you, and then we'll go back to Hamid.
Maybe Hamid just didn't put his hand back down, but I guess we are getting close to the end. I will quickly say that Bukele's government has arrested people who are not gang members, but people who are good social justice activists, including one that this congregation has had decades of a relationship with, and they're not getting due process. So I agree that Bukele is definitely overstepping. I don't see El Salvador as becoming more like Costa Rica. I see it as becoming more like Nicaragua. But my question is really, you've written, it's back to the idea of how do we reach the people who need to understand the benefits of migration. And you've written for the Post and the Times, Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune. How about other social media? I mean, also NPR and the radio, but there's some, those are all kind of postal elite social media sources. I saw a wonderful, and I'm going to send it to you and actually the whole immigration committee at River Road, a YouTube program called Long Story Short that was excellent about pinging each of the misconceptions about, I just heard it last night, but it's really good. I mean, like they bring drugs, no, like 0.02 of the people who are crossing the border walking carry fentanyl,
Yeah.
This is, and they take our jobs. No, they take jobs that nobody else wants. So it was, gee, YouTube, I wonder what you think about how we can get the message out through other social media that our people, younger people, are listening to more these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yes, I listed those sources in those elite sources because they are elite, so they sound good. But I try to talk a lot to local level. For example, I was interviewed recently by a right-wing media outlet in Brazil. I talked to them, and the story was good. More centrist stuff in Chile. In the US, the Sinclair Group. So there's this. So a lot of local stations, so a lot of local newspapers, I talk to them. I know some colleagues are saying, oh, don't talk to them if they're not in the New York Times, the Washington Post, you're wasting your time. No, it's important to reach smaller publics where they are. So I try to do that because, some people are consuming those news, and then it's important to change the narrative even in the smaller venues. Then the social media, absolutely. So I encourage you, if you have Twitter, to follow me at Dr. Ernesto Cast. Or more importantly, the Immigration Lab, which is immigration_lab, or the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. We're very active on Twitter and address these issues kind of real time. We have a Facebook page, but I think it's less successful and less active. And we're hearing from students and young people that they do Instagram more actively. They are not much on Twitter, so we're trying to spread to Instagram to do this. But still, to address millions of people, it's something really hard. I don't think we are gonna do it. I mean, me particularly from the center, it'll be good, but it's hard. And I'm finishing another book that is about that, myths of migration, and then I go with a lot of literature, with a lot of data to counter these myths, like the ones you mentioned. And I think that'll be good for students, because also come with a lot of misunderstandings from high school, for people that are college educated, etc. But what is a big threat for advancing this better narrative is people that more and more say, no, I mean, I'm a white nationalist, so I have nothing against immigrants, they're fine. but I want America to stay a white country. And if you're coming from Jamaica, you may speak English, but if you are Black, we don't want you here. And they say that in a way that they wouldn't say after the civil rights movement for a while. That wasn't something that you'll say politely in public. But more and more people are, and they were emboldened by Trump, but they existed before, and we have documented that are saying that online, and they're reaching a lot of people in video games, in chats, in forums online, where they say, no, America should, and again, this is not something, not the first time that happens in American history, but they are making a racial argument or Christian nationalism, right? That the US has to stay a Christian nation, and that's the most important thing. And they don't care if you're taking jobs or not, if you came legally or not, if you, no, you are not white, we don't want you here. And that's an important base of the Trump base. That's an important percentage. So they won't listen to any arguments, and they have a very clear ethno-racial project of purity, and very dangerous. I mean, it sounds like Germany before World War II, because it is. So that's the tricky part, and I think maybe the center and the rest of the population, we have been too tolerant with this intolerance, and we have to be more categorical that language is not only not correct or not polite, but it is dangerous. And when people have done stuff and push the limits, like in January 6th, they should be prosecuted and criminalized for attempting to many of them, they say openly, again, it's a minority, but they are very active and very committed to start a racial war. So those are the people that do not listen to our arguments, but are out there recruiting and proselytizing very, very actively. So that's a challenge for all of us that believe in democracy. And you're right about El Salvador. I'm not trying to say that this is becoming a more democratic country. It's not, but in a way, it is responding to some of the needs of the population, and the migration story may change. What it seems it won't change is that advocates and organizers are going to have to keep living El Salvador and other countries like they have been doing for many decades. And hopefully we'll help them, and we can help them. The ones that make it out of the political prisoners, yeah, that's a tough issue. But again, I think we can put pressure from Washington to hopefully help those cases. It is unfortunate, but the need to migrate because of the big control that the gangs have may decrease. We will see.
Well, thank you, Dr. Castañeda. We really appreciate you sharing your vast knowledge on this really important topic of immigration. Can we unmute and thank Dr. Castañeda? And don't forget, next week, 2 weeks from now, April 16th, will be a discussion of reparations.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure. Take care and best wishes. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you. Take care. And in American University, anytime you can find me there.